So, what's AHAL, or Against History Against Leviathan? Who's Fredy Perlman, and why do a bunch of online anarchists love talking about that big sea monster from the Bible so much? First things first, AHAL is short for Against History Against Leviathan, as I just said, which is Fredy Perlman's kind of half epic poem, half critical history of civilization, starting from the emergence of civilized societies in Mesopotamia and ending in the kind of vaguely early stages of global capitalism, with the US starting to spread across so-called America. Most of the book, though, focuses on the classical and medieval eras, and largely on societies around Iran, the Levant, and Europe, meaning Greece, Egypt, Assyria, Rome, a bit about England and kind of Germany as well. There are a few key concepts which need to be explained in order to understand Against History Against Leviathan properly. It's a pretty strangely written book. Here's a brief excerpt to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. When the celebrations end, the flushed warriors, the heroes, are not about to return to repairing the canals. The stint of the Logatians is about to end. In fact, the Logatians are complaining that they've already done more for than they ever agreed to do. Who'll do the repairing now? The Lugal's cousins had long been supervising defeated Logatians. They're not pleased by the prospect of replacing the defeated. The captured foreigners are put to work on the canals. Each of the Lugal's cousins is now a Lugal, a supervisor. The Sumerian word is NC. This is a sub-Lugal, an assistant to the Lugal, a boss but not the boss. So there are several things going on here. First of all, you've hopefully noticed the barrage of odd words there. Most of these are Sumerian, like NC, and are concepts which have been introduced by Perlman gradually before this, each as the concept was created by these gradually civilizing people he's describing. These can be confusing and seem a bit arcane if you're just reading an extract rather than the whole book, which I recommend anyone who's actually interested in this does after watching this video. But once you've got a hold of them, you'll understand that they often refer to something very specific which English can't quite convey properly. More importantly, though, they enhance the actual structure of the book by turning concepts like positions held by people in a hierarchy or power structures themselves into characters which play a role in a story. That's the other essential part, I think, to understanding Against History, knowing that it's a story and not a standard historical work. It isn't quite a work of fiction. It sits somewhere between the position of fiction and historical fact, kind of similar to the role which a myth might take, sitting at the root of a culture, containing both factual truth and the kind of important fictional allegory that affects the way people frame the world. Against History is often about taking what is known in the historical record and working outwards from there, filling in the gaps where the historical archive has neglected to recount the stories of those it deems unimportant to a grand scheme of things. This is often the work of those of us who tend to examine history through a more liberatory, anti-civilizational lens. It can also be seen in other areas like queer historical fiction, which is important not because it necessarily gives a completely accurate representation of the past, but because it gives a story to people who don't often have one. This is what Perlman's doing throughout the whole book. Even though he was certainly building on the work of others, he specifically credits writers like Turner and Kamat. He was writing a complete work, the critical history of civilization, the likes of which had not really been done before, and therefore he had to lay the foundations in such a way by writing a story, which has the advantage of also being a format which civilized histories tend to ignore and discredit, making both the content and the format insurgent against Leviathan. So, a few definitions of the words which I've mentioned earlier, which are going to be used a few times throughout the video. Firstly, there's Lugal, meaning king or ruler in Sumerian, but literally translating to big man, which Perlman generally uses to refer to kings or rulers or bosses. Next, Lugal Zaghazi refers to a specific king of Sumeria, but Perlman compares various rulers throughout history to him because he is also referred to as NC or Sacred King, which is useful to remember because it reminds us of how Sumerian religion grows alongside the rise of the Lugals, and this is mirrored in later societies as well. Zek is also used heavily and originates from Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which Perlman makes reference to in the introduction of the book. Zek means prisoner in Russian, but Perlman uses it to refer to almost anyone who lives within Leviathan, even those who seem to be leaders, as he sees them as also being Zeks to Leviathan itself. Leviathanic armour is a really important concept too, which Perlman introduces with this passage here. The armour comes off, even if it is not merely worn like clothes or masks, even if it is glued to face and body, even if skin and flesh must be yanked off with it. The armour does come off. This should give you an idea of what he means by armour, that it's the kind of shell which humans adorn themselves with, and which both shields their wild selves and protects them from other humans. Armour is also a useful metaphor when it comes to discussing whether someone has fully extracted themselves from Leviathan, even when it seems as though they have escaped, such as when Perlman describes Moses' flight from Egypt with the Israelites. The word Leviathan deserves a whole section to itself, really, and Perlman does actually dedicate an entire 2 pages, in my edition anyway, to describing it, in his typical semi-poetic style, but I'll try to cut it and simplify it a bit. He starts by describing Thomas Hobbes as one of the NC's distant descendants in a much later era, meaning England in the 17th century. He details how Hobbes is capable of recognising as more than just a city, but rather one of the world's first states. Hobbes would, in Perlman's eyes, describe it as an artificial animal, something brand new, something neither man nor nature dreamt of. It is that great Leviathan called the Commonwealth, or State, in Latin civitas, which is but an artificial man. This is the basic concept of what Perlman means by Leviathan. He is picturing a state in as much the same way as Hobbes did, as an artificial creature created by humans. He also goes into how the NC would think of this state as strange and novel, but Hobbes is so thoroughly domesticated that he is unable to think of anything that is not artificial. Hobbes is only able to describe a human being, even one who is not artificial, in relation to the mechanical workings of a clock, whereas the NC, to whom Leviathan is still novel, does not even know what a clock is. Perlman also discusses whether Hobbes would agree with Yeats, describing it as having a lion body and the head of a man, but Perlman himself agrees with how he imagines the NC would see it, as a giant worm, and not a living worm, but a carcass of a worm, a monstrous cadaver, its body consisting of numerous segments, its skin pimpled with spears and wheels and other technological implements. He knows from his own experience that the entire carcass is brought to artificial life by the motions of the human beings trapped inside, just as he knows that the cadaverous head is operated by a mere Zek, the head Zek. Perlman also disagrees with Hobbes' idea that Zeks made a contract with the worm to animate it, knowing that rather they were forced into it at spear point, and that the true head of the worm is not a man, but rather the temple ziggurats of the Sumerians within which the Lugals reside. Side note, this always reminds me of that Godspeed You Black Emperor lyric. We're trapped in the belly of this horrible machine, and the machine is bleeding to death. But I don't think that lyric is directly inspired by the concept of Leviathan as a dead worm. It works though, I think it's actually a quote from somewhere else. Perlman breaks this idea of Leviathan being a worm corpse later on, describing Phoenicia as an octopus Leviathan instead, because it's seaborne and reaches out to colonize various places through trade. This can seem to mirror the anti-Semitic trope of Judeo-Bolshevism as an octopus controlling the world, but Perlman actually directly addresses anti-Semitic ideas of Jewish people in this regard in typically Perlmanesque fashion. The prejudice of later ages will portray all Jews as merchants, but from King David's time until King Hezekiah's, the ins and outs of commerce are more alien to them than Baal is. Perlman instead describes Israel as a worm Leviathan, contrasting it with its octopus neighbours of Phoenicia, Tyre and Sidon. Perlman also, interestingly, describes the difference between the two species of Leviathan as this. Both live off the surplus product of Zek's labour, but the worm uses most of its surplus to enlarge its head and body, its officials and armies, whereas the octopus keeps most of its surplus continually circulating between sources and destinations. He then also points out that the octopus's strength is in its ability to bring more of the biosphere into its tentacles' reach, while the worm commands far greater physical power. There are exceptions to this rule. Perlman points to the British Empire, an octopus with the power of a worm, and the American Empire, a worm with the tentacles of an octopus. It's tempting to just go through the book bit by bit from here, and I think that would kind of defeat the point of this video, as I'd just end up reproducing the book point for point rather than offering a kind of more digestible introduction to it. So instead I'm going to try and talk about what I think the most important, interesting points in Against History Against Leviathan are, and how Perlman talks about them. One bit which tends to get me a lot in AHAL is Perlman's repeated examinations of how people who are outside and threatened by Leviathan often end up consumed by it or recreating it through their very attempts to escape or defeat it. One example is his telling of the creation of the Persian Empire, which begins with a fun explanation of Zoroastrianism, pointing to Ahura Mazda, the good or light god in Zoroastrianism, as being an embodiment of freedom and wildness, while Ahriman, the darkness, is the inside of Leviathan and the disruption of the wilderness. He also makes a nice little nod to Nietzsche while talking about Zarathustra/Zoroaster. It's the same person, but one is Greek, one is the Persian word for him. Perlman then points to how Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, takes this liberatory spiritualism and clothes himself in the mantle of Zarathustra, leading people who wish to see the destruction of Mesopotamian and Levantine Leviathans into creating their own one by mistake. Perlman also talks about why it's possible for him to do this, which I think is even more important than how he does it. He talks about how there is a revulsion from the Strait of Gibraltar to the China Sea, and the object of revulsion is Leviathan. He talks about how the simultaneous emergence of Taoism and the similarity between the figures of Zarathustra and Lao Tzu indicates a generalized rejection of civilization and all its masks and armors. He also points to Buddhism and even the Pythagorean cult. This isn't the only time Perlman describes something like this either. He goes over much the same story when Christianity first emerges, at a point when the people are beginning to see the gaps in the armour of the Roman Empire, and sees early Christianity as part of a similar movement of people beginning to remove their Leviathanic armour. Although he makes a distinction here in that the people are not coming from outside Leviathan to destroy it, but are beginning to remove their armour when they have been born with it on already. He specifically refers to how the Roman captives withdraw by removing themselves from the artificial beast's shell while still inside. He also admires Jesus' commitment to not falling into the traps of leaders from the past, who urge people to follow them, instead focusing on the kingdom of God is within you, and how important it is that Jesus portrayed himself as just another human being. Despite this, Christianity ends up becoming Romanized, and the Roman Empire gradually morphs into Christendom, and eventually the Catholic Church, which must one day be challenged itself by heretics who remember the original message of Christ. Perlman seems to particularly like the Hussites and the Waldensians. In Perlman's words regarding Constantine making the empire Christian and then calling the Council of Nicaea, all those who object to such a mutilation are called schismatics and heretics. The resistance has come to power, but its first aim is to liquidate all resistance. The wars of Israelites against Ammonites, Edomites, and Moabites are now remembered as precedents for a holy war, and now the persecutors of the resistors wear the halos. The reason why all this rings so true to me is the way in which Perlman is able to track all this to the more recent experience of radicals in the modern world. We've seen the revolution betrayed dozens of times now, and how often the forces of counter-revolution are clothed in the same colours as the revolutionaries once were, from Napoleon to Stalin. Perlman is casting Constantine and all subsequent rulers of Rome and Christendom, be they emperors or popes, as the ancestors of these same men. There's a lot of other elements to this bit of the book where he's discussing these concepts, including a really fun way of writing about the Roman Empire's gradual decline and dunking pretty hard on a lot of historians who clearly venerate the empire and ignore its horrors in favour of worshipping its progressive civilization or whatever. I'm not going to talk about that though, because I don't want to just recount the book word for word. This does bring up another interesting thing which Perlman also does though. He, from here on out, tends to chart a story of people's attempts to escape from and destroy Leviathan, rather than falling into that trap of despairing while recounting its ability to swallow the world. Perlman is adamant that continual decomposition is the normal state of artificial worms in the field. The human beings, reduced to springs and wheels, never cease to resist this reduction. This is in large part what AHAL is, a recounting of stories of people who refused the logic of domination and power, instead attempting to be free, and how that took myriad different forms across time, but that there is a continual thread of people who know that they can live free throughout. Perlman sees what we call history as actually being the story of how Leviathan tried to crush these people. Again, I want to emphasize the way in which Perlman writes about all of these things. He's writing about actual historical events throughout the entire book, and he discusses known historical figures, even mentioning the kind of cloudy and unsure origins of people like Lao Tzu and Zarathustra, who may have actually been amalgamations of several different thinkers or prophets. But he talks about them in a way which goes beyond the historical fact or record. He embellishes them and tells a story about each of them, and he does this in a really weird and interesting way. He manages to avoid the typical pitfalls of looking at history through the lens of great men doing great things, and sits in an interesting other place where for some people he casts them as almost institutions in and of themselves, as something other than human, also mocking the great men of history school, but in a way which makes clear his distaste also for the humans behind that mask. At other times, he paints people who we are only used to hearing of as either literal biblical figures or demigod-like historical giants, as just ordinary human beings who are doing human things, flawed and damaged by their lives, trapped within Leviathan. For example, he does a thorough character analysis of Moses, asking seriously why he does what he does, what exactly his position is with regards to Leviathan, and where his absolute hatred of the Egyptians and their King of Kings comes from. There's even this weird little bit where he compares him to Lenin for some reason. Moses is neither a modernizer nor a primitivist. It is clear that he is an armoured man who is unable to remove his armour. He is like Lenin. He seeks within but finds no destination there. All he finds in himself is bits of Leviathanic armour. He hates Ur and Ashur, and his contemporary Tukulti Ninurta makes him shake with rage. But the only voice inside him is the voice of Lugal Zagizi, the voice of the Almighty, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the male of males. Lenin will hear the voice of electrification, yet Moses hates every specific King of Kings, just as Lenin will hate capitalists. Moses abstracts the king, makes him a god, just as Lenin will abstract electrification and make it communism. I mean, he's not exactly wrong, it's just very weird. I don't really get the bit about electrification and making it communism, but this is pretty typical of Perlman when it comes to this kind of thing. He makes a good point, but in a very roundabout, allegorical way, which often clearly shows his position on more recent issues. He was personally just very disillusioned with Leninist Marxism, in my opinion at least partially as a result of witnessing the betrayal of the May 68 uprising in France by the French Communist Party and the unions they controlled. There's actually a lot of not very subtle digs at the USSR throughout AHAL, especially towards the end, and it's clear he viewed it as a great portrayal of one of the latest in the series of movements for liberation from Leviathan, which he's attempting to chart in Against History. A few more fun bits about the book. Firstly, there's this great bit about the Lollards and the English Peasants' Revolt, where Perlman quotes from John Bull twice, who was part of the insurrection, in a way which makes clear the communistic ambitions of these peasant insurrectionists. The first quote is just a couplet, but one which I think is almost like a medieval version of modern protest chants. When Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? The second is more obviously communistic. Good folk, things cannot go well in England, nor shall until all things are in common, and there is neither villain nor noble, but all of us are of one condition. A lot of the rest of the book is actually about communistic tendencies and Christian heresies, to the extent that I'd say about a third to a half of the book is an attempt to illustrate that idea. He then positions the Protestant Reformation as the recuperation by Leviathan of these heresies through the creation of the nation-state, which enables rulers to simultaneously rid themselves of the church as a political entity, but also of the anti-church radicals. He specifically points to Bohemia and the Hussites with regards to this, describing the league which the Hussites form in order to defend themselves from the Catholic Church trying to put down their revolution, as the thing which then becomes the first nation-state, the thing which they create to protect themselves, then becomes a new form of Leviathan. This particularly makes sense to me, actually, and also can be seen in the way in which some places which resisted the English Reformation under Henry VIII, Yorkshire, Cornwall, much of the north of England actually, were the places where the most radical forms of post-Reformation Protestantism ended up cropping up a century or so later. These were the places which were least under the control of the centralised English state based in London. They were physically furthest away from the kind of metropole. These people were not necessarily fighting out of any particular love of Catholicism when they resisted what ended up becoming Anglicanism. Rather, they were fighting against what they knew was an attack on their communal, freer forms of life by the Leviathan. To finish out, I want to just briefly go over some of the bits of Against History which I've not focused on as much during this video, because I want to give just a little bit more of a taste of the book, so that you can go and then read it yourself if you're interested. A huge part of some of the later parts of the book which I've left out involves a lot of history which has since been called into question by further scholarship, etc. This is things like the existence or real organisation of the people called Cathars by the Catholic Church, who Perlman heartily embraces as existing, and this does not damage the narrative because the facts he's relying on have come to be questioned. This is, to me, evidence of the mythical nature of Against History. It doesn't matter whether, or the extent to which really, the Cathars were real or not. What matters is that there were people during that period in southern France who questioned the normal ways of doing things. And the church was so scared of them they were forced to create their own myth against them. The Cathars were created as a myth and continue to exist as one. Only now Perlman has helped turn them around into a myth for the resistance against Leviathan. Perlman doesn't make his connections between these Cathars and the Hussites and the Bogolamists and the Zoroastrians because they were all collectively aware of one another necessarily and attempting to revive each other from the past, but because they were carrying the same torch of actual human life, even in the guts of Leviathan. It's the same reason why it's okay that Perlman sometimes twists the truth, as historians accept it anyway. The point of the book is not to teach us truth or facts, but to give us a narrative. Perlman posits that America was a mythical place in a Scandinavian saga and a closely guarded secret of Basque cod fishermen to Europeans before Columbus was even born. And it doesn't matter whether he's right. I've read the saga he's talking about, and it's generally agreed to refer to Newfoundland, and there are even letters, historical records of a bishop in Iceland being very much aware of the existence of Vinland. I don't know about the Basque thing though, so. What matters is that it's a good story. Perlman actually addresses this directly when he discusses a particular story from the Anishinaabe, who he refers to as the Potawatomi, regarding a character called Whiskey. To know that Whiskey actually existed was both impossible and trivial. Such events will be considered facts and raw data by the Leviathanite, because the linear progression of such events constitutes Leviathanic time, named his story. The Leviathanized will remember only fragments of the sole events they consider worth remembering, because the memory of such events will not be lodged in living human beings, but on stone tablets, on paper, and eventually in machines. Perlman himself compares the stories he recounts in AHAL to stories about Atlantis, or Mu, sunken continents, which used to contain these mythical, massively advanced civilizations. He knows full well that he's only telling stories, and that's all he's trying to do, not to construct a history. So that's about it for my introduction to Against History Against Leviathan. I just really want people to read this book. It's amazing. It's really enjoyable to read. I think I've read it 4 or 5 times over now. It's probably my favourite book. I'll include a link down in the description to definitely the Anarchist Library version. I'll see if I can find anything else on like LibGen or anything like that. So you can pick it up yourself and check it out. Thank you very much for watching. So I've got another couple of videos planned in my head. Not quite built out yet, but just so that there isn't this long gap between videos that I've had with this one and the last one. I'm probably just going to do a spoken version of an essay which I've already written in the past. You might see a couple of those come out. Oh well, see you in a bit. Goodbye.